I built a $1,250 gaming PC. Here's how it went. For the processor, I chose the Ryzen 5 7600X. I would have chosen the 7500F had the pricing been normal, and while it still was the cheapest out of all of them, the Ryzen 5 7600X was actually cheaper than the regular 7600 non-X. It boasts a very high clock speed, starting at 4.7 GHz, and it has 6 cores and 12 threads, which is enough for what I'm doing. For the motherboard, I chose the ASRock B650M Pro RS Wi-Fi. This is a good motherboard because it supports AM4 coolers on the cooler mounting area, supports up to 4 sticks of RAM, which would be good if AMD supported that in future processors on AM5, and it has 2 PCI X16 lanes, one of them being 4, that's where my graphics card is, and one of them being 3. It also has 3 places to put an M2 SSD, one of them being Gen 5, 1 Gen 4, and 1 Gen 3. It also has really good I/O, which includes, I believe it is 2 USB 3 ports, 4 USB 2 ports, a USB-C port, HDMI and DisplayPort, which I don't need because I have a graphics card. It has places for Wi-Fi antennas, BIOS flashback, and surround sound audio. Oh, and let's not forget the Ethernet port, but I didn't use that. Going back to the topic of AM4 coolers on AM5, the cooler I chose was the Thermalright Burst Assassin 120 non-RGB, and I actually have it in front of me right now. Now, this cooler is neat because it has support for both AM4 and AM5, and it has support for a ton of Intel sockets. I think that one's 12th through 14th gen, that one is, I believe, 10th and 11th gen, and that one is probably 4th gen all the way to 9th gen if I had to guess. Now, the reason it's compatible with AM5 is because a backplate removal is not actually required. You can just use the standard backplate, and it came with thermal paste, but I was prepared. I brought my own to the table, which was the Arctic MX6, which I think it's like one of the better thermal pastes on the market. It plus this cooler did a good job right here. If I ever want to upgrade processors though, I will probably also have to upgrade the cooler to the Thermalright Peerless Assassin 120 SE due to its better cooling and dual radiator style. For the RAM, I chose the Team Group T-Create Expert at 6000 MHz, and I chose 32 gigs of it because you can't really do much like high-end gaming with less than 32 gigs these days. And since it's DDR5, it has both Expo and XMP if you're on LGA 1700 for Intel. I do want to hand out a few warnings. To my knowledge, you're not really supposed to have anything besides 1.35 volts for the 6000 megatransfers a second and CL30. And speaking of CL30, the only CL30 timing you should be getting is with 6000 megatransfers a second and with 30, 36, 36, 76 timing. Any other timing besides 30, 36, 36, 76 is probably going to mess things up. And the experiences of other people who have told me their experience. For the storage, I chose the Kingston XG 7000 2TB. The reason I chose that version is because it is faster than the SSD inside of even the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. I also, for storage, took the hard drive out of the Linux box. Don't tell it I said that. And it worked fine when I built the PC. However, as of recently, so June 2024, it's been making weird noises, and games that are usually unaffected by it have been much slower than usual, so I might have to replace it, hopefully with something larger too. For the graphics card, I chose the AMD Radeon 7800 XT. Now I know what y'all are probably gonna say, AMD graphics cards have driver issues. No, they fixed those 5 years ago whenever they launched the 5700 XT. Anyways, this card has 16 gigs of GDDR6 video memory. It even has some ray tracing, though admittedly all games look the same whether they're ray traced or not these days. It also has FSR 3, which admittedly is worse than DLSS, but I don't need it because it's a high-performing graphics card, so I'm fine in that area. Also, it says in the supported OSs section on the back it put Linux before Windows, so that's a big W. This thing also has 3 display ports, but it only has 1 HDMI port, which makes it pretty clear that AMD is trying to move towards a more open source standard, which I believe is a good thing. Now, the funny thing is, it says minimum 8 gigs memory to run this graphics card, recommended 16 gigs. But have you actually ever heard anyone who has the same amount of VRAM and RAM? Because these days the ratio should be about half and half. And of course, I mean, there's not much else to be advertised. It's not like Nvidia with the AI stuff and the DLSS. So I think that's probably it for the graphics card, other than the fact that it looks really nice. Oh, I forgot to mention, it does require 2 PCI inputs as far as PSU cables go, and it requires a 700 watt power supply, assuming you have all the other components. Speaking of power supplies, the one I chose was the Corsair RM750E, and I chose a 750 watt power supply because it's around the recommended 700 watts for my graphics card. For the case, I chose the Montech Air 100A RGB. This is a micro ATX case, which is around the size a lot of people are using these days. It has room for 2 2.5-inch SATA SSDs and 1 3.5-inch SATA hard drive. Now, cable management in this case is good. It comes pre-cable managed, the front panel does. And I did, quote-unquote, cable manage, but, well, I'll put it like this. I managed to shove all my cables under the PSU basement with care. Firing up Cinebench, we got a score of 117, beating the Apple M1 Max, which was honestly the only thing on single core I expected my processor to fall behind, so I'm surprised that it beat every processor on this list. Moving over to multi-core, we got a score of 843. Now, everything that I expected to beat my processor beat my processor. These are the ones that didn't beat it in single core because they have a ton of cores and were designed for multi-core, and all of the processors that I expected to stay behind mine did. After testing the 7600X in Cinebench, I tested my 7800 XT, which got a score of 10,681 and beat everything on the list. I don't even know how to explain this. After I finished testing in Cinebench, I went over to Geekbench, where on my 7600X, I got a score of 2,960 in single core and a score of 13,328 in multi-core. After testing my CPU, I tested my 7800 XT GPU in Geekbench, and I got a score of 143,123 with OpenCL, and a score of 161,475 using Vulkan. With the NVMe SSD I put in my build, there wasn't much to say. It ran at its advertised speeds, which is faster than current gen consoles. The mechanical hard drive surprisingly ran at the speeds I expected it to. The however comes in whenever I say that games that are unaffected are still running slower. The failure of this drive, by which I mean the literal mechanical failure, is kind of confirmed by the noises that it makes more often. The first game that I tested for this video was Fortnite. I played on high settings, 1080p, with TSR set to medium, TSR quality set to high, and I disabled nanite geometry, shadows, global illuminations, and reflections. And with this combination, I was getting about 260 to 320 FPS when actually in a match, so like combat with the other players, and I was around 220 to 250 when I was in a moving vehicle. The next game that I tested was Forza Horizon 5. Now keep in mind that I am loading this game off of a hard drive, but I don't think that it affects the FPS. If it does, let me know, and I'll probably test it on an SSD and update y'all of any differences. I think in 1440p this would have run at the target 165 FPS like expected to, given that it ran between 200 to 220 FPS in the 1080p Ultra benchmark. After Forza Horizon 5, I tested the finals. I tested this game with a combination of ultra and high settings, and I had ray tracing turned off. Now, I think the FPS actually went down while I was recording, because when I wasn't recording, I was getting about 270 to 310 FPS. Honestly though, the physics in this game and the graphics are amazing, and I'm surprised by how well even powerful computers can handle this game, because it is probably one of the few good games with good graphics that are semi-realistic, or even realistic at this point. Whenever I first tested Minecraft on this computer, I had Linux installed. So it was getting about, I'd say, 1200 to 1700 FPS in single player, with, I want to say, 120 mods installed. I think that's about right. Meanwhile, on Windows, I'm getting about 900 to 1400 FPS in single player with 25 mods installed. If we're talking about rethinking voxels, then go back to Linux configuration for mods, and I was getting probably about 200 FPS in single player, and honestly, I think 250 in multiplayer, whereas I'm only getting about 90 to 130 on Windows with just 25 mods. And yes, the render distance is all the way up. In Plague Tale Innocence, I got between 290 and 320 FPS on Windows, and 340 FPS on Linux, but I don't have a recording of that. This was on 1080p Ultra settings. In CS2, I usually get around 350 to 375 FPS in 1080p high, however, it seemed to go down to below 340 while I was recording. Also, CS2 is literally unplayable on a 60Hz display, so to not publicly humiliate myself, I was playing a botted demo match. Now here's the final question. What would I change? Well, to be honest, there's not much I would. There's maybe like two things. I think that I would change the processor from a 7600X to a 7500F to save money and have more room in the budget for something like a 7900 GRE. However, honestly, I'm okay with the compromise between, like, instead having a 7600X and having a 7800 XT, if it means that I get to flex the 4.7 gigahertz clock speed base. Other than that, I do not think there is anything else I'll change, or would change. I do think that I will be buying a 1440p 165Hz monitor for Prime Day in a couple weeks. This is so that maybe I won't completely suck at CS2 and my PC's power is actually going to be utilized somehow. Other than that, I think that's about it, so, see y'all.